Beatrice Hartwell and the Duke of Ashford. The whispers found Beatrice Hartwell as inevitably as winter found the North Garden. At 27, she had become the kind of woman drawing-room mothers used to frighten daughters with. Unmarriageable. They pointed her out in clipped tones. Young ladies crossed themselves at the memory of her plainness. Gentlemen curtsied past as if she were a shadow. Hartwell Manor, once a place of small triumphs and family bustle, had reduced Beatrice to a careful stillness. She tended roses that did not ask for judgment, read novels whose heroines were agents rather than ornaments, and painted landscapes she would never live inside. Her sisters were everything she was not. Charlotte, married this spring to the Viscount of Chiswell, had silk and a laugh that made men lean in. Margaret was already promised to a son of good blood. Their mother no longer introduced Beatrice at balls. Her father addressed her as he would the house ledger. Acceptance, once sorrowful, became a quiet, domestic habit. Beatrice imagined the life at Hartwell of looking after aging parents, of being the kindly aunt who read to visiting children beneath the drawing-room wainscot. It was not romance, but it was survivable. Then the solicitor arrived on a grey October morning. Beatrice had been reading in the library when her father, who seldom summoned her, sent for her. In the study, her parents sat statue still. A thin man in black held a leather case. "Aunt Josephine is dead," her father said, the words like an earthquake. Josephine had been Beatrice's only true ally, a globetrotter with ink in her letters and audacity in her pocket. The solicitor opened the case. "Lady Josephine leaves you her fortune," he read, and Beatrice's chest hollowed. Townhouse in London, estate in Kent, jewels, investments. Her mother gasped. Her father went pale. Then the lawyer cleared his throat. There was a condition. The room held its breath. The lawyer produced a parchment. Lady Josephine had planned, measured, and signed. She had signed a contract made 20 years earlier, when Alexander Blackwood, now Duke of Ashford, was a boy, and she, his godmother, had watched him grow. If Josephine died while both their families remained unmarried, Alexander must marry her named bride within 3 months or forfeit his portion of the Ashford inheritance to charitable trust. If both accepted, both kept their inheritances. Refuse, and the fortune dissolved. Beatrice felt the world swing. Alexander Blackwood was a myth in London. Handsome, wealthy, implacably single for 5 years. Mothers schemed to catch his eye. Daughters swooned when he entered a room. The absurdity, an unmarriageable spinster forced into a duke's bed, should have been comic. Instead, a small, strange fire ignited inside her. Aunt Josephine had given her independence. She would not refuse it to spare some noble pride. When the solicitor closed his case, she heard herself say, steady and shocked, "I accept." Her mother wept. Her father struck the desk. The lawyer nodded. 3 months, he said. The wedding must take place. Night fell. Beatrice stood at the nursery window and watched the Hartwell paddocks blur into an October navy. Aunt Josephine had put her name in the papers tomorrow, and the rumour mills of London would grind faster than the winnowing machines of Kent. She pressed her hand to the chill glass and, for the first time in years, felt not only dread, but a small, forbidden bloom of hope. Alexander read the notice in Ashford House, in a room where contracts normally smelled of cedar and ink. He read the letter 3 times, sat down hard, and rung for his steward. It was impossible. Lady Josephine, his godmother, the only woman who ever scolded him for vanity without flinching, had bound him from beyond the grave. He could refuse and watch the Ashford fortune be sliced away, dooming tenants and charities, and the livelihoods bound to his name. He could consent and marry a woman he had never met. The account books resolved the calculus. 70% of the estate's capital hinged on that ancient generosity. Refusal would not merely bridle his pride, it would unload ruin. He spent 3 days in a study of glass and books, measuring future loss like one counts winter coal. Then, on the 4th day, he ordered his horse. He would meet the woman his godmother had chosen, rather than gamble with lives he had been entrusted to protect. Beatrice got the summons as rain streaked Hartwell's leaded panes. "The Duke of Ashford requests the honour of calling upon Miss Hartwell tomorrow at 2, said the footman. At once, the house became a storm of hemming and polishing. New curtains, a dress refitted, advice from Charlotte about smiles and silences. Beatrice listened in silence. She knew what this visit would be. An inspection. A cool appraisal of the last woman they could mark as acceptable to spare the Ashford name. When Alexander entered the drawing room, the rumour of him proved truer than any sketch. Broad-shouldered, dark, a face chiselled into the kind that city painters sold a dozen copies of to the wrong sort of admirer. He bowed, and Beatrice curtsied. He regarded her as one takes in a landscape object, a momentary study. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I am honoured." "Your Grace?" She felt her voice as if through silk, thin, careful. He asked for the garden, that proper stage for sincere speech. In the wet hush they walked between clipped yews, the country pressed around them like audience. "Be honest with me," Alexander said abruptly, the steel at his tone not unkind. "Do you want this?" She met his eyes. "I did not ask my aunt to bind you to me," she said. "I accepted my inheritance because I would not be invisible forever, for the sake of someone else's pride. I accept knowing it costs you. That is enough to make me ashamed, but it is also my choice." Something like admiration or curiosity passed across his face. He surprised her by laughing, short and disbelieving. "You are the first person in years to answer without preface," he said. "Most smile until the question goes away." They negotiated, as people with property and names do. He proposed a legal arrangement: marriage to preserve estate and title, a public life performed, private lives separate, each keep the part of the fortune they brought. It was a contract dressed as mercy. She accepted in words. In the marrow she recoiled. A gilded loneliness was still a loneliness. They married 6 weeks later, in a ceremony so small it would scandalize the papers, only for curiosity rather than reputation. At the altar, the kiss was a courtesy. They signed, sealed, and travelled to Ashford House in separate coaches. He installed her in the east wing, his rooms in the west. The place was beautiful and indifferent. For a month they kept their bargain exquisitely. Alexander's days were mercantile and grim. Beatrice occupied the conservatory and library. He observed her with the same precise attention he gave ledgers and contracts, and she noticed the servant's affection blossom for a woman who neither begged nor performed. Yet the bargain broke her in tiny increments. She had thought unmarriage meant not wanting it. It turned out, to be chosen and still not known, was another kind of hollow. Then, the midpoint ruined the arrangement. A cousin, the clever, small-mouthed Lady Evelyn Devereux, began to whisper that the Duke had been coerced into marriage by an outside fortune. If she could point an insinuation at Beatrice, that the bride had been mercenary, desperate, she could bind Ashford's social alliances to Devereux's clan. The whispers multiplied. A crude pamphlet suggested Lady Josephine's benevolence hid a bargain in which Miss Hartwell would loot Ashford. Gossip swelled until steady diners at White's murmured of cause and consequence. The steward presented a letter stamped with a claim that a clause had been misread, that the original contract required the Duke and bride to cohabit for 6 months, or the wealth be donated. Suddenly, the neat separation they had agreed on could not be executed without appearance of bad faith. Alexander faced a dilemma no ledger could untangle. Maintain the contract as a public sham, but keep private lives separate, and risk forfeiture through reputational slight. Or live the marriage publicly to demonstrate cohabitation and invite the intimacy neither knew how to offer. The estate, the tenants, his name, all trembled. When the first pamphlet hit the streets, Beatrice did something neither the world nor she expected. She stepped into the drawing room, closed the door on servants and society, and spoke to him as a partner, not a paper clause. "If the house will burn for my sake," she said, "let us scorch it honestly. I will not be a shadow who keeps your reputation whole while my life is hollow. We married. Let us either be married, wholly, or not at all. No more middle rooms." The admission, an irreversible choice in domestic morality, stung harder than any scandal. Alexander had mapped his life in measured ownership. Her proposition was chaotic and whole. For the first time, he considered sacrifice, not as arithmetic, but as a moral account. If he refused to live fully, what had he won? If he lived fully, what would he lose? He chose, after examining tenants' ledgers and his own conscience, to attempt honesty. He would live the marriage outwardly. He would learn the strange apprenticeship of spouse. That was his irrevocable act. To risk the fortune's safe margins to see if two contracted people could become a chosen pair. The aftermath was not immediate romance. It was awkward dinners where both fumbled toward intimacy. It was Alexander reading that very book Aunt Josephine had sent to Beatrice and asking, at midnight, what passages had changed her. It was Beatrice standing in the kitchen, apron dusted with flour, while he watched as if the act was exotic. It was, also, Evelyn's barbed notes and Charlotte's embarrassed visits, and Margaret's uneasy congratulations. Ashford House creaked under the strain of gossip and habit, but gradually, measured in small mercies, the partnership shifted. Alexander apologized for things he had never seen as wrong. Beatrice let herself be seen for the first time. She confessed fear like an open wound, and he learned to treat it not with pity, but with astonished respect. He noticed how she arranged the books in the library by the color of their spines, not out of whimsy, but because it soothed her. She noticed how he kept a ledger of the village school's donations, not to boast, but because children there would go cold without them. No scene ever arrives fully formed. The kiss that mattered came not at a gala, but one thin December evening, when the wind shuddered at the panes, and they found themselves alone over letters that belonged to Josephine and Alexander's late father. Alexander read a passage aloud and laughed, and the sound broke something in them. He bowed then, voluntarily, without ceremony, and kissed her mouth, and she returned it with a tremor that was both apology and acceptance. They would not be unbroken lovers. Both carried scars. The sting of deception from marriage's forced origin. The family fractures that would not heal by vows alone. Charlotte never stopped being proud and distant. Lady Evelyn continued to needle. Village rumors slid like sleet. Some nights, Beatrice would feel her old, familiar invisibility pressing back, as if the world had remembered how to look past her. But there were also mornings she found Alexander at the greenhouse, knees dirty in the loam, laughing at a stubborn rose. There were afternoons he spent reading aloud from books she loved. There were months where a neighbor's child fell ill, and they walked together to the infirmary with a hamper of broth. Aunt Josephine's last act had been audacious and slightly cruel. She cut the leather straps that bound Beatrice to a life of being overlooked. But she did so with a clause that forced two proud people into a negotiation of the heart. The great mercy of it, the only possible mercy, was this: that two people, bound by contract, might choose one another afterward, clumsily, slowly, and wholly. In the warm lamplight of Ashford House's library, where their shadows finally learned to agree on the same shape, Beatrice and Alexander sat together and rolled out an unfinished plan. To build a wing for the tenants, to restore Josephine's library in the town, to sponsor a small school. They would spend money and tenderness both, and perhaps the world would judge them still. They could endure it. They had learned, painfully, that the opposite of being invisible was not spectacle. It was staying. And in staying, they discovered a strange, steady sort of choosing. The newspapers printed everything, of course, but Aunt Josephine, had she been there to see, might only have smiled. She had always liked stubborn apprentices. She had left Beatrice not merely a fortune, but a permission. To be visible, to be chosen, and to choose in return.